Most Americans think Canada's biggest export is maple syrup. In 2025, it's actually that Canada holds critical geographic leverage over freshwater, energy flows, and emerging Arctic routes that matter to the US economy. Canada has around 20% of the world's surface freshwater, but its use is bound by binational agreements, provincial authority, and indigenous rights. We'll rely on current 2025 trade, energy, and policy realities to separate what geography allows from what politics would permit. What options would a Canadian government actually have to restrict flows, and how fast could the US realistically respond? The map itself already hints at the answer. The geography America can't redraw. Most Americans rarely consider how fixed physical features shape power, but on this map, the lines tell a stubborn truth. The US shares the world's longest international border, roughly 5,525 miles, with a country that spans from the Atlantic to the Pacific and well into the Arctic. That landmass doesn't just look impressive. Its position determines how essential resources reach the United States. Canada holds substantial geographic leverage, and nowhere else offers the same combination of routes, quality, and proximity. Three distinct systems feed south from that northern territory: water, electricity, and fossil fuels or critical minerals, whether buried deep or moved through steel pipelines. All three take their course because the terrain dictates it. Rivers follow slope, engineers route pipelines where grades allow, and shipping lanes emerge where coasts and currents make them viable. You can't change those flows quickly. Politically feasible alternatives take decades. Even with unlimited funds, reworking these channels isn't a matter of years, but of generations, because geography sets the baseline timescale. Replacing major cross-border resources takes decades and huge capital. Geography sets the baseline timescale. Historically, major North American infrastructure shifts, like the Trans-Mountain Pipeline expansion, have required years of planning, permitting, and construction just to enhance an existing route. That was to increase export capacity, not uproot and reroute entire supply systems. Attempting to recreate a continental-scale network from scratch would be slower still. This asymmetry often goes unnoticed because Americans focus on absolute size: 330 million people compared to about 40 million Canadians, an economy many times larger, unmatched military reach. Those strengths are real, but they don't erase where rivers begin, where grid connections originate, or where ports are naturally positioned. In specific chains of supply, those physical origins sit beyond the US border, upstream in every sense. Along much of the higher northern ground, Canada holds the headwaters that feed basin systems to the south. It controls narrow segments of coastline through which vessels must pass to reach the open sea. It occupies the starting points of long-haul transmission corridors supplying major US grids. And because of the pattern left by glaciation, many mineral and hydrocarbon reserves are located north of the line, with viable access only from Canadian territory. In every case, the US is downstream or downline from resource flows that cannot be duplicated elsewhere without sacrificing efficiency or scale. Changing any of these brings hard limits. Replacing Canadian water inputs means finding alternate sources of comparable volume and reliability, securing rights to them, and building the treatment, storage, and transportation links to the same cities and industries now served. For electricity, the permitting and construction of new high-voltage transmission lines is an even steeper challenge. Projects often face a decade or more just in the planning stage. Building or shifting mineral supply chains is slower still, involving exploration, site development, extraction, processing, and logistics over many years. Even the United States' engineering capacity can't compress those realities. Geography channels infrastructure through specific passes, valleys, and corridors. Change the crossing point and you face longer, costlier routes that often demand entirely new rights of way. Where the most optimal route lies in Canada, the US has little choice but to work through it. Canada's ability to influence those choke points stems not from matching military size, but from where the border physically intersects essential pathways. This creates a gap between global image and regional constraint. America projects power worldwide, yet its energy grids, industries, and agriculture depend on continental features shaped long before human settlement. Ice, rock, and river patterns laid out the routes millennia before the first treaty or customs station. Borders were added on top, but they didn't shift the flows. From a security perspective, this narrows U.S. options in any dispute. Expanding domestic capacity can relieve some pressure, but you can't reverse a river's slope or widen a channel without tackling decades-long environmental and logistical barriers. Diversifying imports away from Canada often means hauling goods across oceans at greater cost and with new exposure to disruption. None of these match the efficiency or resilience of the links already in place. Recognizing these structural patterns reframes the power balance. Population, wealth, and armament do not alter where resources originate or how terrain shapes their movement. Pipelines, railways, and shipping routes serve the geography they inhabit, not the political ambitions drawn over them. Trying to move them outright leads back to the same bottlenecks or forces dependence on weaker alternatives. In practical terms, Canada's role in the continental resource ledger includes assets the U.S. cannot readily substitute, especially given that nearly 20% of the world's surface freshwater lies within Canadian borders. Those circumstances turn geographic facts into enduring leverage, flows that begin north and run south. And among those flows, one stands out for its scale and immediacy, underpinning not only industry but daily life. The water factor no one talks about. In 2025, Canada's share of the planet's freshwater remains unmatched. About 1/5 of all surface freshwater is within its borders, stored in lakes, rivers, glaciers, and aquifers. This isn't just about big blue shapes on a map. It's a connected network of systems that form in Canada or pass through it on their way south. That geography links roughly 40 million Americans directly to sources they do not control. The link is physical, not theoretical. The Great Lakes Basin alone is a shared cross-border water body, structured by agreements that explicitly limit bulk exports. But one side of that basin sits entirely within Canadian jurisdiction. The Great Lakes Basin is the clearest example of this connection. It straddles both countries, but the way water moves through it gives Canada influence over how the system functions. Lake Superior, the world's largest freshwater lake by surface area, straddles the border but draws much of its inflow from Canadian land. From there, water travels through Lakes Huron and Erie before moving toward the Atlantic. That journey is fixed. There is one outlet, the St. Lawrence River, which passes through and alongside Canadian provinces before reaching the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The St. Lawrence Seaway, an engineering system allowing ocean-going vessels deep into the continent, runs across both nations' territories, but key segments lie in Canada. On the US side, cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, and dozens of others pull their drinking water from these shared lakes and rivers. Their industries use it for cooling, processing, and manufacturing. Farms in the surrounding states use it for irrigation. Disruption to the availability, quality, or timing of those flows would be felt almost immediately. Because the lakes are also a transport route, any interference upstream has a parallel effect on trade. Bulk carriers loaded in Duluth or Toledo navigate waterways under joint management, but locks and channels in Canadian territory remain essential links in that chain. Add to this the physical Chokepoints Canada sits alongside. The Detroit River connects Lake St. Clair to Lake Erie along the border. The Niagara River links Lake Erie to Lake Ontario, containing both the falls and major water control works. Dams, gates, and diversions here stabilize levels for navigation, hydropower, and flood control. These projects are coordinated through binational institutions like the International Joint Commission. But because their physical location is accessible to Canadian operators, authority over actions taken there is a shared but not symmetrical arrangement. While a sudden, large-scale diversion of water into overseas exports is largely blocked by the Great Lakes Compact and its companion agreements with Ontario and Quebec, Canadian authorities could still influence how and when water moves in more subtle ways, through regulatory shifts, new environmental permitting requirements, temporary operational limits for maintenance, or even by imposing additional coordination fees in certain contexts. Any of these could alter the rhythm of flows enough to cause knock-on effects. For example, a change in timing could force U.S. treatment facilities to adjust operations or prompt shippers to delay runs to match navigation depth requirements. What makes all of this significant is scale. The Great Lakes contain about 84% of North America's surface fresh water, billions of gallons that no alternative system can quickly replicate. Alternate supply strategies like desalination or large-scale interbasin transfers would involve decades of construction and extraordinary costs. In most practical scenarios, the U.S. cannot simply switch to another source without severe economic and logistical trade-offs. The protections that exist, such as the Compact, Ontario's and Quebec's mirror agreements, and oversight by the International Joint Commission, do work to prevent unilateral bulk taking, but they don't negate the reality that operational controls, infrastructure access, and key decision-making points are not all on one side of the line. In situations where climate stress lowers water levels, questions about priority, whether to maintain shipping depths, supply municipal systems, or protect ecosystems, gain urgency. Having jurisdiction over strategic links in that system means Canada's position in those conversations is unavoidable. Climate variability sharpens the stakes further. Lower snowpack in the Canadian Shield or prolonged warm seasons can contribute to reduced lake levels. Drought in the western and central U.S. boosts the strategic value of the relatively stable Great Lakes supply. In years when navigation is at risk due to low water, decisions about adjusting flows or managing lock operations could directly affect grain shipments, raw material transport, and regional energy generation. Even modest seasonal flow restrictions could reduce hydroelectric output and slow vessels moving through the St. Lawrence Seaway, effects that ripple wider the longer they last. Energy overlap adds another layer. Many of these same shared waters feed hydropower facilities. The infrastructure that controls water for navigation or flood prevention also helps regulate turbine flows. For now, that cooperation has remained functional, but its dual-use nature means that any operational change for one purpose inevitably touches the other. A maintenance project or regulatory change proposed under environmental or safety terms might, as a side effect, reduce power generation or alter shipping schedules. The hypothetical image of Canada shutting the taps entirely is not realistic under current legal and political conditions, but influence isn't limited to absolutes. Adjusting maintenance schedules, changing flow allocation priorities, or modifying licensing frameworks can all have measurable impact, especially if they coincide with periods of already stressed supply. In such cases, the interruption is less about dramatic cutoff and more about delay, uncertainty, and cumulative cost. A plausible restriction scenario could unfold quickly. If an upstream control point in Canadian jurisdiction altered its discharge rates, whether for ecological management or infrastructure inspection, downstream water levels could change within days. Municipal reservoirs might adjust draw times and treatment rates. Industries dependent on high-volume intake could face tighter operating windows. If navigation depths fell even temporarily, shipping lanes might see delays, routing changes, or partial closures, all of which have economic consequences. The effects would scale over weeks, but sensitive sectors would notice almost immediately. In practice, the water systems linking the two countries have functioned on the basis of mutual interest and shared stewardship. Yet physical geography ensures that the starting points and some crucial control nodes reside in Canada. Those placements can't be redrawn. They're set by watershed lines and gravity. The most realistic levers Canada could pull are measured rather than extreme, but even incremental changes in a system of this size can cascade into energy, agriculture, manufacturing, and trade. From the perspective of continental interdependence, the Great Lakes and their outflows are not just pipelines of drinking water. They are also the arteries powering industry, shipping, and more than one form of energy production, which means the next layer of this story isn't far from view, because the same flows keeping taps running in U.S. cities are also driving turbines north of the border. Not just water, power flows too. Beyond supplying one of North America's largest water basins, Canada also moves a steady current of electricity into the United States. Hydroelectric facilities across its provinces convert falling water into power, and a portion of that output crosses the border every day through an interconnected grid. While electricity trade is a smaller slice of overall energy exchange than oil or gas, it remains critical for certain U.S. regions where domestic supply alone can't match demand patterns. In 2023, Canada exported about 49.4 terawatt-hours of electricity to the U.S. and imported roughly 16.7 TWh in return, according to the Canada Energy Regulator. Those exports were valued near $4.3 billion, with imports worth about $1.6 billion. Most of the exported power comes from hydro plants in provinces such as Quebec, Manitoba, Ontario, and British Columbia. These facilities benefit from vast reservoirs and river systems that would be difficult to replicate elsewhere in North America without enormous environmental and social costs. Their scale and consistency make them a dependable source, especially during seasonal peaks. This dependence is most visible in places where cross-border imports directly balance the grid. In New England, high-voltage lines from Quebec feed a meaningful share of daily consumption, stepping in when local generation dips or when natural gas prices climb during cold snaps. Parts of the upper Midwest draw on Manitoba hydro to smooth fluctuations from wind power, keeping the grid stable when generation from turbines is low. Even New York State bolsters its diverse supply mix, with energy imported across transmission corridors that span the St. Lawrence River. Unlike oil, gas, or coal, electricity doesn't have alternate transport modes when a corridor goes offline. High-voltage lines must directly connect generation to demand, and these interconnects are limited in number. The key links are concentrated in specific crossing points: Cornwall, Ontario into New York, Quebec into Vermont and New Hampshire, Manitoba into Minnesota and North Dakota, British Columbia into Washington state. Each route is the product of decades of engineering and regulatory coordination. A single high-capacity line can supply power to entire metropolitan areas or act as a stabilizing source for a broader grid segment. Maintaining these crossings is resource-intensive. Towers traverse forests, wetlands, and border rivers, often in challenging conditions. The infrastructure for high-voltage direct current lines, in particular, reflects years of investment and is not easily duplicated. Adding new interconnects requires lengthy permitting, land agreements, and cross-border regulatory approval, projects that commonly take many years to deliver. If a particular city or state depends on a given line, losing it abruptly creates a gap that is not easily filled from domestic capacity alone. Nature of hydroelectric generation adds to its value in grid operations. Hydropower can ramp output quickly to meet sudden demand spikes or replace shortfalls from variable sources like solar and wind. During a heat wave in New England or a cloudy, still winter day in the Midwest, Canadian hydro can adjust within minutes to maintain frequency and voltage. This flexibility supports not just meeting demand, but also preventing instability from cascading into outages. In winter, the reliance can grow sharper in the Northeast, where pipeline limitations often cause natural gas prices to spike. Being able to pull in consistent, relatively low-cost Canadian hydroelectricity helps utilities avoid either paying sharply higher rates for gas-fired generation or resorting to older, less efficient oil-burning plants. That buffer against volatility underscores why, despite representing a modest portion of total U.S. electricity consumption, these imports carry a high regional importance. There is also an environmental component to the equation. Because most of the power is generated from water, the carbon footprint at the point of production is minimal. For U.S. states with renewable energy targets, counting Canadian hydro as part of their clean power portfolio is less costly than building equivalent domestic capacity on a tight timeline. But that environmental benefit can also deepen the dependency, since losing the source would mean either buying high-emission replacement power or accelerating costly new projects. From Canada's point of view, exporting electricity south is economically stable and often framed as mutually beneficial, with long-term contracts locking in purchasing commitments. Yet the physical reality remains. Portions of the US grid are wired to assume these imports will continue uninterrupted. The substations, converter stations, and underwater cables that make those assumptions possible cannot be substituted quickly in the event of a disruption. The vulnerabilities are not about instantly plunging entire regions into darkness. National grid systems have redundancies, but about the outsized impact on specific areas if a high-capacity interconnect were lost or reduced. With only a handful of major crossings handling the bulk of the power flow, local disruptions can strain backup systems, push electricity prices higher, or limit the ability to meet peak loads. Regulatory changes or negotiated adjustments to export volumes could shift market dynamics without any physical damage to the lines. For most households and businesses in the US, the presence of Canadian power in the mix is invisible. Demand is met, devices run, and daily life carries on. But replacing even one significant north-to-south interconnect would take years, not weeks. Existing domestic infrastructure often lacks the margin to absorb the full loss of imported megawatts, and any new capacity, whether renewable or thermal, would face the same permitting and construction hurdles that delay large infrastructure elsewhere. In many ways, these flows of electricity illustrate how geography and investment have bound the two systems together in ways that are hard to unpick. The power lines link hydro reservoirs in one country to industrial sites and population centers in the other. They cross where terrain, distance, and political coordination have made them possible, and their small number makes each one strategically significant. While electricity is only one component of cross-border energy dependence, it shows how limited physical connections can carry large regional consequences if disrupted. The stakes are measured not just in megawatts, but in how much flexibility both countries have built into their grids, and in several regions, that flexibility is thin. If moving electrons between countries can create these kinds of regional vulnerabilities, the role of moving liquid fuels is on an entirely different scale. The infrastructure and volumes involved there reach far beyond balancing a grid during peak demand. And as we'll see, those links are not just important, they are embedded in the very framework of how energy moves across the continent. Oil and gas through a northern funnel. In 2024, Canada supplied roughly 4.1 million barrels per day of crude oil to the United States on average, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, making it the largest foreign supplier to the American market. Those flows also included natural gas liquids and pipeline natural gas, with combined hydrocarbon exports to the U.S. valued at tens of billions of dollars annually. This is not peripheral trade. It's a core component of the continental energy system, tied to infrastructure built over decades to move oil and gas largely in one direction, south. Most of this crude begins in Alberta's oil sands and conventional fields in Alberta and Saskatchewan, moving through a small set of high-capacity pipeline networks. The Enbridge mainline system is the largest of these routes, but it operates alongside other major cross-border pipelines such as Keystone and farther west, the recently expanded Trans Mountain route to the Pacific. Together, this small number of corridors carries the overwhelming majority of exported volumes into the United States. Once across the border, these flows feed directly into refining hubs in Illinois, Ohio, and along the Gulf Coast, where facilities are configured to handle the heavy blends common to Canadian crude, such as Western Canadian Select. The routing of these pipelines reflects both geography and economics. The most direct, cost-effective gradients for moving crude from Western Canada lead across prairie terrain into the Midwest. Canada's west coast still has limited capacity for moving crude directly to international markets, and eastern export routes depend on long coastal or inland shipping via the St. Lawrence. The fixed southern corridors have become the main outlets, linking into broader U.S. distribution systems that branch supply toward industrial centers, population hubs, and marine terminals. Canada's role in supplying natural gas is just as geographically defined. Large-diameter transmission lines move gas south from Western Canadian sedimentary basins, with compressor stations regulating pressure along fixed rights-of-way. These crossing points are few in number, but handle constant high volumes, linking directly to American storage sites, citygate systems, and power plants.